This is Revealing Our Origins, the Builders of the Old Kingdom Pyramids, and Their Purpose. And this is Charles Berlitz, who was the son of the man who started the Berlitz Language School and wrote several marvelous books. And on one of these, you'll see an Enochian letter. Apart from these signs, we've got these possibly go back, it's suggested this goes back with us, Homo sapiens sapiens, as early as 30,000 years ago. We have these rock art symbols, which is another form of writing, and these from Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, various parts of the world, animals, and then later on with the Bronze Age or Stone Age, we begin to see the ox and the plough. This is an early cave drawing from the Pyrenees of a horse and rider, showing that there were horses being ridden much earlier than people accredit. And we now find from modern research horses, the earliest horses are found in Andalusia and not out in Russia. Very important point, and there are links there to this concept of Atlantis having horse races 9,500 BC, and we actually find the earliest horses not far, the nearest they can get to Atlantis, which is Andalusia. I took that picture on a visit to the Pyrenees. That's the High Pyrenees, and you've got still that native breed of horses on the Pyrenees who would have been ridden by the Basque. This is the Basque region, and way before that, I'm sure, the Sulitrine people who produced the fantastic flints and skills, which went around the Atlantic, around the world. They have links with the Ainu, and I believe, and I've given in earlier lectures, the information which suggests that the world was being travelled around by the very early people who were immensely competent with their boats. This is from Forbes and Crowder. This is the justification for reviving the idea that writing may be perhaps traced back to the Ice Age. It's based on the fact that a considerable number of deliberate marks found on parietal and mobile art from the Franco-Cantabrian region are remarkably similar to numerous characters in ancient written languages extending from the Mediterranean to China. So here we have these lines here. These are the Franco-Cantabrian signs, and you can see enormous similarities right the way through the system of writing from all the various societies, hieroglyphs, Sumerian, pictorial, Indus Valley, Linear A, Linear B, right the way through to China, which is a very important point, and I'm going to touch on that later. That's a larger version, so you can see more clearly that we have, going back to literally the Ice Age, we have all the letters that we find much later in different languages being used and being inscribed. Now, some of these will be signs, some of them will be numbers, some of them will be a form of writing. And it all begins to, you can begin to see there was one world and one language and probably one voice. The first or oldest city which we've currently discovered is Jericho, and the dates for Jericho are 9,300 BC, and we have the excavation by Kathleen Kenyon here into the side of the tell, which gave us the accurate dates for Jericho, and give us a very important clue that we have to span back to 9,300 BC for civilized people doing civilized things. At Jericho, the first tokens which were used were these tokens, and they were marked by individual farmers with their particular name or their particular mark, and the token was a particular size for whatever it was, a bag of grain or 3 bags of grain or 2 animals, which were taken into the center, the community, town, the administration, and with the farmer keeping his set and delivering a set to the town accountant, if you like, which is a lovely system of double entry bookkeeping for records. That's the first time we find that kind of system operating, and surprisingly enough, we find that at all these sites around the Near East from those very early dates. They were the oldest clay-fired objects of their time. This evolved into the proto-cuneiform clay record-keeping tablet here, where you've got sheaves of grain and animals and numbers, etc., very detailed records. And later on, these became more sophisticated, and they became clay envelopes so that the tokens could be put inside and the envelope sealed, so you had a more secure system of record keeping. We have writing on tortoise shells discovered in modern China, were dated to 6,600 BC. This is one of the most important tablets from the Nipper collection, and it is relating to man's golden age, and it deals with this period of time, sometime before the fourth millennium, describes the blissful and unrivaled state of man in an era of universal peace, before he had learned to know fear and before the confusion of tongues, before his free will was taken away, perhaps. Another very important clue, we've got this before the confusion of tongues, which gives us the clue there was one text, one language, one writing right the way across the world for the ordinary people and for the administrators. But here we get a very valuable clue from an excellent translation of the Uruguay tablets, which are quite well known. And it says here, now as to the letters, in times past in other lands, and even in this one since the great King Sargon, and the date for King Sargon is 2700, and you'll see how that's been achieved by Waddell. Modern archaeologists and Assyrians, etc., put the date quite differently from the date agreed on by Waddell and Petrie and all the early great archaeologists. The figures of clay have been marked by picture and symbol, but in all this time there has been what is called the Aleph Beg, the civilized language. These have been kept secret amongst the followers of Nebo, Nebo being Enki. For Nebo has many followers in many lands under many names, and the symbol for his work is the circle, and at its center is the star of 6 points in its spiral, something for Dan to look at there. What we're talking about here is that the ordinary people were given the pictorial text, the picture signs, but in-house there was a writing which was the Aleph Beg-based writing. And we find this through all the civilizations early on. If we look hard enough, even the Druids had an in-house writing for the administrators, for the, if you like, the elite, but the ordinary people were given the simple picture language because it was so much easier and so much more sensible. And it suggests much greater sophistication in ancient times, as we saw this morning with the story of Enoch, who's also called Hermes. He's also called Thoth. Enoch is the Hebrew name for Hermes. So we're all talking about one great historian, one great leader from an early time. This is the interesting part of the story with the secrets of Enoch. And this is the story in the O'Brien book, which I'm just going to read in full because it's so essential to give us clues as to what was happening. And then the Lord said to Michael, now Enoch had been taken up to the planted highlands, to Karsag, to meet the great Lord, and he was shown round the settlement by two very tall angels, and he is taken up to the great Lord. He's absolutely terrified, of course. And the Lord said to Michael, take Enoch and strip him of his own clothes, anoint him with fine oil, dress him like ourselves. And Michael did as he was told. He stripped me of my clothes, rubbed me over with a wonderful oil like dew, with the scent of myrrh, which shone like a sunbeam. And I looked at myself, and I was like one of the others. There was no difference, and all my fear and trembling left me. So simply being anointed with a white fluorescent type of oil, smelt like myrrh, made him look just like them. And this, in my opinion, is very clearly evidence of skin protection at a time when the Earth's atmosphere was very seriously damaged. Then the Lord called on one of his archangels named Uriel, who was the most learned of them all, and said, bring out the books from my library and give Enoch a pen for speedy writing. Tell him what the books are about. And Uriel hurried off and brought me the books, smelling of myrrh, and handed me a pen. The sincerity of this account is quite remarkable. With no heroics, no bombast, just an honest statement of his human frailty in the face of what must have been a most terrifying experience. The parallel Sumerian account shows that this building to which Enoch had been brought was the large, brilliant cedar wood building on the high rock, the great house of Enil. And so we're talking here about a speedy writing, which I believe is the Aleph Beg, the in-house writing of all those people going back thousands of years, which we may be looking at the angelic alphabet as another extension of that basic process. Clearly, they had to communicate, and it's clear that the angelic communication was with a limited number of people. We have another clue from Ashburnapal, who collected a magnificent library of cuneiform tablets and said that he'd been taught to read the writing from before the flood. The Aleph Beg was taught in the royal schools. And that's the quotation from the Phoenician letters was a letter from a tutor to the son of a king at the royal school in Eurogrit. And so you have confirmation that at the royal schools, where the administrators and key people were educated, in the Druid tradition too, because I've linked Druids back to Karsag and Tuva Tuatha Danann in my other talks. And so we have another clue that in-house, and the oldest writing was the Aleph Beg, and it went back way before the flood. Another very important clue. Now we come on to vertical picture and symbol signs. We find that the identical Indus Valley and Eastern Island scripts are also found in South America. And you can see they're identical. And these two scripts, both unbroken, have been found in diametrically opposite points of the Earth's surface, each being 1/2 of the world's diameter away from each other. You have the actual very earliest picture signs in Mexico and Crete. And you can see the similarities. They are, as you can see, identical across here, similar signs, facing a different way, but with the plumed hat. And the 5, what is it? That's the, 7 numbers there. 7 lords. A dog's face, which tells you different things about the dog, submission, fierce, whatever. These are all used as pictures to describe particularly the pictorial text. Now, very interestingly, we also have these signs, comparisons between the Hittite and at Pashamak. Now, Pashamak is on the coast of Peru, a hell of a long way away from the Hittites, but you've got very strong examples of that picture language all around the world, the Indo-European picture language all around the world in very early times, going back 3, 4, 5,000 BC, when this proto-Sumerian existed. So we have evidence here of the whole world speaking one tongue, using one system of writing. And all these examples here are comparisons, very similar comparisons between the Hittites in Anatolia and the people living in Peru at Pashamak, which was the most magnificent city in South America, according to the Verrills, the Verrill husband and wife team, who produced some of the best research on this whole subject, but have not really entered the mainstream of archaeology for very peculiar reasons, but that's another story. Now we have the Phaistos disc. I went to an international conference on the Phaistos disc and found that out of 60 people, there were only 2 who had the faintest idea that the earliest writing was this vertical picture sign. And I'm just going to go through that now. It starts in the center with the sign of Zeus, the 8-petaled symbol of Zeus, and then winds around to tell you a story. It probably also is used for other purposes, but O'Brien translated this as the Shining One, the Great Lord An or Anu, who was a supreme being for everybody, going back to Egypt, all around the planet, right back to 9,500 BC, and one of the members of the original group with Enlil, Ninkarsag, Enki. And we're going to see Utu later, who was one of the key people whose name was came from Utu, Uta, Ogmash, Sharmesh, Ogma. Jew, speak, an open mouth to speak. Very straightforward. That's a petal symbol, divinity symbol. Hasten, hurry, quickly was a particular plant. That's clearly collect or help. That's raise up and go. And this is spread out. And there are 43 signs to look at on there, and they're all on the display board in the other room. Similar here, surround or capture, grain or corn, cattle, that's a cattle hide, and the copper used to be brought down the Mississippi River and beaten out in that shape, so they were stacked and carried easily. That is 7 all, a very early number. This is a lord or prince or king, and he's got this plume on his head, like a Mohican haircut. The head man or the overseer of the farm had a ring in his cheek to distinguish that he was less important than the chap with the plume on his head. This means cut or destroy, and all these size pictures were easy to understand, but then they developed into very complex cuneiform, which is clay with cut reed and inscribed on the clay, and they changed over time. But each of the signs had a word or a pronunciation to go with, it had a name for each of the signs. This is the 8-rayed divinity symbol of Zeus here, and we can see it evolve from what was called Emi-An to Emi-Q, and then the various changes through to the cuneiform and in Assyrian times at 1000 BC. And here the same sign, this sign here through Knossos and the archaic symbolic Sumer, which you see the Ur dynasty and Assyria, and this is the sign, 8-rayed divinity symbol of Zeus, who is the same person as An. Here we have both signs, and Christian O'Brien translated this, and you can see it, as I say, in the other room, it's a story of a pastoral disaster. The great lord's cattle getting out and trampling over the corn and knocking down the beehives, etc. But it is divided into 12 segments, and with the system of a 360-day year, to which you add 4 days, which are added as holidays, so that although it's a 360-day year, it actually matches precisely what is happening in our planetary system and the movement of the Earth around the Sun. And they were able to very accurately calculate each year, and we're doing it from way before 5000 BC. It's very important to get that point. So we're going back to the scribes. This is the scribes, a lovely picture by Hergé for the National Geographic Society before the Second World War. The art of writing is the mother of orators and the father of artists. It's a Sumerian proverb. And here you see the fantastic cylinder seals and the clay tablet and the scribes at their work. One of the earliest forms of writing has been these seals. These are beautiful seals. You can perhaps not see them clearly, but they are beautiful stamps and seals, which are used from the earliest times. And we're still using them. Some people are still using a seal on wax today. This is how the cuneiform script evolved, and this is the formal official version. And as I say, only 2 people at the International Conference in the Phaistos Disk knew anything about these picture symbols, which were vertical, then turned, and then a more efficient, practical way of writing, quicker way of writing, and then to the cuneiform itself. So by the time you got to this end here, and if you didn't know what was happening here, you would never be able to translate anything up the line. And here we have another example of head, and with head goes the word sag, and jin to walk, su hand, se barley, nanda bread, a water, water, ud day, and musin bird. And you can see how those change their characters into eventually the cuneiform. So anybody who wants to understand the Sumerian cuneiform had to understand the vertical picture language. This is another example of the same very early Proto-Sumerian language on a very hard, inscribed on a very hard black rock. I'm not sure which one it is, but I'll find out one day. Here we have more signs, and you can see the theme here and the pronunciation of the earth, key, mountain, cur, and domestic man, and you've got all the actual head again, sag, meaning head, a meaning water, and every single language that we use today around the world, you can see how the words have been derived from a single original source. So they all go back to one original source. Now what L.A. Waddell did, which is very important, is he recognized that Sumerian was a starting point, and the Egyptian writing was very similar, but the Egyptian was derived from the Sumerian. And these are all examples of the very early pictorial text to show that the hieroglyphs evolved from the Sumerian pictorial, all one origin. Same again, similar situation, where you've got the signs here very similar and recognizable to anybody who's studying it. Back to An and the star and the sun god, Ankh, similar stories right the way through. And they are all available in the book in the back of the hall if you want to have a look at them. Now, this is Waddell's decipherment of the Menes Menes, because Menes is an important figure, and we're going to talk about Menes here because it gives us so many clues as to what was really happening in the ancient world. And this is why an understanding of the Sumerian, the Indus Valley, the Egyptian, and all these languages allowed Waddell to be so reliable and accurate in the work that he did. But here we have Egyptian pictorial again and the Sumerian or Mesopotamian equivalent, and parallels all the way through. I'm not going to dwell on these because I want to just establish the theme is there and for you to see with your own eyes the various features, like the bird here, and then the bird is drawn. Bird was originally drawn in Mesopotamia like that, but made more realistic in Egypt. Here we have the same again. Then we have the numbers here and similarities between the numbers. We also have this business of cut marks, which are another interesting part of what was being written all over the world. Now, the oldest known pictograph writing is at Uruk. The Uruk occupation dates are now revised to 4,500 to 3,250 BC. I want you to think about this date very hard because we had well over 1,000 years of a peak of civilization with a city of maybe between 50 and 80,000 people in this period here. Then we had at this time desiccation, drying out of the Mesopotamia, climate change, and the city of Uruk almost closed down at that point. And we're going to look at the cause of the catastrophe and the problems. And then, of course, we get the startup of what we call the pre-dynastic Egypt at this same date. So we see evidence of people having to move from Sumer to a better place to live, and the elite moving from Sumeria into Egypt. The oldest pictograph writing was at Uruk, site of present-day Al-Warqa, and that's where we find the oldest pictorial. We also find the same very old pictorial, which you can see the similarities here, on the Aegean Sea in Turkey at Smyrna at 4000 BC. These are we're going back a long way, and we have to go back a long way with our history to really understand what's been happening. This is an administrative tablet with a cylinder seal impression of a male figure hunting dogs and boars, and that is Uruk. And the date they've given for that is 2900 BC. Here we have another extraordinary parallel, because what we're looking at here is Sumerian signs, but on an Indus Valley tablet. And we're talking here about the victory seal of Magdal, Lord of the Indus Valley, a Sumerian crown prince of Mesopotamia. Now, what we have is Indus Valley being a colony of the Sumerians from about 4000 BC. This is the story. And here we have cedar trees that are deodar cedar, very close to the species of Lebanon cedar. And going back and we're seeing that this all originated in Lebanon, the Garden of Eden or Karsag site, with all the details of that are on the DVDs, is in southern Lebanon near Mount Hermon. And many of the features we see here and the cedar trees could well have been brought from the first instance, and it's the same with the Atlas Mountains. They're such a close species, they must have been introduced, and it's believed that they were cultivated initially at one place, which is Lebanon. And behind these here are the mountains where we have the lapis lazuli and gold and silver. So we find all these people going to where there was gold and silver and all the kind of commodities that they were using in a very sophisticated world. And this is how sophisticated their world. This is Dolivera town and citadel, which is the southern end of the Indus, and it's before the great catastrophe which knocked everything flat, which I'm going to come to. But here we have incredible sophistication, rather like Uruk, where we had 1/3 orchards, 1/3 houses, 1/3 clay pits was the Uruk term. But here we got a similar thing. An administrative building, not a temple. A temple is a word that's used time and time again in error. They were taimons, taimen. They meant sacred areas. Temples are something that came on very much later, and a way we've got into our particular world of thinking that religion is the be-all and the end-all. But they were dedicated these areas to the gods who had delivered civilization to them, and these were always sacred areas in all the main administrative buildings. And the mosques run on a similar principle now. The Indus Valley script, or rectangular seals, you can see how wonderful they are here, all those features, but you'll see the similarities of what we've seen before, just to add to the weight to the argument. Same again here, of Menes and his son Nama or Naram Singh, and you'll see the beauty of those objects. Waddell's key point here is realizing that he could check all the Sumerian king lists by comparing them with the Indian epics. And when we're talking about the Indian epics, we're talking about the Vedas in particular, but we also have the Eddas in Britain. And Waddell will explain very clearly how the Eddas in Britain were the same kind of linked to the same story as the Vedas in India, with at the head of the family tree being Thor, and Thor being the first Sumerian king on Waddell's king list. This is again a little more on the Indus Valley, Sumer, and the translation. Same again, the fish sign, people recognize that through. And same again, you see how similar the Indus Valley signs are, if you go back and look at it properly, to the Sumerian. One and the same, that's where they came from. And here we have a tablet from another tablet from Ur, and if you look on the wall, you can see in the same proto-writing, proto-pictorial picture writing. Here you see is the divinity symbol of eight-petaled, or the eight-spiked symbol of Zeus as it evolved over time. That's very useful because it allows you to date a lot of these objects much more accurately, to see what particular sign they had drawn for Zeus, or An as the key person. This is the great ebony label at the Menes tomb at Abydos. And the date of Menes' death is 2640. This photograph was taken by Sir Flinders Petrie, who was the top man of his times, and many people will know that he was shunned by the Palestine Exploration Society, who had funded him, because he started telling them things they didn't want to know about religious history. And of course his dates were rubbished by later people. And remember also, we lost so many fantastic people during the First World War that we never recovered from the loss of those great men who had to fight in the First World War. And our civilization, Britain, was at a peak before that First World War in all this intellectual research. Another lovely image here. You can see the bird here, and you can see boats here. Lovely features. And the story of Menes is great. I'm going to do a little bit more about that later. Now, establishing the origin, pictorial origin of the cuneiform, this scholar in 1897 said it didn't exist, but we find George Barton, who was the man who translated the Karsag epics, and the top man around about 1913, and his book, published on the Karsag epics, has been gone through in detail by Lawrence Gardner and is available in report form from me if anybody wants to see it, to show that Christian O'Brien translated 80% of that material, which is in The Genius of the Few. But Barton, everybody accepted at that time Barton's view that the original signs were modeled after the human body and its parts, after mammals, birds, insects, fishes, trees, stars and clouds, earth and water, buildings, boats, household furniture and utensils, fire, weapons, clothing, implements of worship, nets, traps, pottery and musical instruments. Totally practical, so anybody could understand what was going on. So the picture text given to the people was something that they could all understand spatially very quickly and use very effectively. And that was where it started. So we started with an incredibly sophisticated system. And that adds weight to my argument that we are all, our ancestors were an advanced civilization. Terribly important that we are the product of an advanced civilization, and we have to relearn from past history all that has been lost. Hieroglyphs express these views quite well. To rule, a shepherd's crook, very sensible. To lead is a chisel. South, I'm not quite sure why the plant may respond to south, I don't know. But to find, this is a bird obviously looking for something, old age, a stick. and a cool, which is obviously a cool drink in Egypt. All very obvious. Now later on, much later on, these hieroglyphs became totally formalized under later Egyptians, not long behind Menes, but they became totally formalized into this kind of picture language, very strict and very strict rules on how everything had to be drawn. And this is in the books on the Dogon, by Laird Scranton, we see that so many of these features, apart from being an alphabet or passing on a written message, are also give very clear descriptions of quantum mechanics, string theory, you name it. And so there's a very interesting element evolved from that early cuneiform, which is being passed down in father and son in southern Sahara today. The pharaonic Egyptian numbers and symbols were standardized again later when the hieroglyphs were standardized. And remember, the Aleph Beg, or the Sumerian writing, was much, much older than the hieroglyphs. This was, in fact, shows the numbering on the Sumerian system, 1, 10, 60, 600, 360, 336,000, and their cuneiform signs. Other signs and developments providing clues to human migrations. This amulet was found and recovered in West Virginia, and it has all these letters on it, which are Trojan, Carian, I can't pronounce them, but Pamphylian, Ayuk, Cappadocia, Cypriot again, Carian. And we're going to just follow this trail a little bit. These are figures from rock carvings in southern Andalusia and signs at Nabila. Now, Nabila's on the Rio Tinto River, and this is where we find the most ancient concrete and the geopolymers that were used in the ancient times in their constructions. And this was the river where the gold and silver, and particularly copper, came down to the sea at Seville. And this has, like Spain, has an amazing history, much, much older than people realize. And we find a whole lot of parallel signs in these areas, so linking southern Andalusia and the Iberian signs at Nabila to the other images all around the world. That's a little detail there, and we're looking at the Libyan and Nabila Seville, these first two columns here, almost identical, and links too with Crete and the Aegean. So we've got so much evidence of a worldwide civilization, very sophisticated, traveling by boat, no problem at all around the world, much earlier than we've been told in our history books. These are pretty obvious, but they're mining marks. They're used, or they may have had other purposes, but James Bailey produced these to show that they were principally marks of the miners who were looking for all these precious metals over that period of time. Here we have an Aztec symbol, which is Mexico City, but on the Nazca lines we have an almost identical image showing the links between Mexico and Peru. Where did you get that hat? Now this is a nice little, lovely picture. I love this one, but look at all these lovely hats. A Phoenician god, a sun god at Palenque, a pottery head, Mexico. A temple relief in Turkey, a relief in Veracruz, and a relief in Mexico. And these hats are very interesting because they show us that Mexico was immensely important from certainly 5000 BC to the people in Europe who were obviously traveling there and back. And Gary Bilcliffe will know that we had he went and took some wonderful photographs of the Coquillo Pyramid. And the Coquillo Pyramid has been dated somewhere between 3,500 to 5,000 BC. But clearly there was a link between the Old World and the New World much earlier than everybody realizes, and that's one of the little clues. And of course there we have that hat again here with Mithras at that time. And just a little bit of interest, Mithras is conducting humane slaughter here, by the way. This is a cutting of the throat decreed by all the ancient peoples. The animal has to be totally relaxed, has to be handled. It shows any signs of stress, it's taken away, and it's only brought back when the stress has gone. So you have no stress in the meat. The key part of eating meat is understanding the animal should be have its throat cut with a very sharp knife when it's totally relaxed. principle of good meat management and good livestock management, and still seen today all over the Americas and all parts of the world where native people, who some of them still remember the old instructions given them by the gods. But Mithras, the temple of Mithras, would you believe, lies in the basement of St. Peter's at Rome. So if you get onto the basement in St. Peter's of Rome, you can say a few nice words about Mithras. Here we have more clues from Waddell about ancient British pre-Christian monuments and pre-Roman coins showing goats and deer as goths. And goths is a very important word we're going to follow on and look at, because our ancestors, mostly in this country, and the prominent good people were the Goths. And here are the clues within British coinage and British history. And there's a story, of course, that we have Indara is the same person as Thor, and Thor is the same person as one of the most senior king of the Sumerian dynasty, at about 3260. And here we have a reference to Archangel Tassier Michael. And a little bit of a battle between what are called the demonist Totans. The ancient British and most of the civilized world, particularly the Aryan Christians, and I named the Goths amongst them, were and understood the serpent knowledge of the ancient world. It was the denigration of the serpent knowledge, the serpents being wise men and wise women from the Garden of Eden site, or Karsag, and in maintaining their philosophy and practice was absolutely crucial, which the Druids did right to the time of the Roman occupation. But the problems feuding between the serpent, people who were against the serpents as opposed to people who were promoting the good order of the serpent organization, that has been a key feature in our religious history. And we take that in simple terms to St. Patrick, who went to Ireland for the Catholic Church to banish the serpents. I'm going to touch on that later. Mason marks, again, we've heard a lot about stone building. We obviously have a fantastic tradition amongst the Masons, who would have been taught by the culture bearers, who were the angels, archangels, and watchers from Karsag. And they were, if you like, were the culture bearers, and the Masons represent this extraordinary line of tradition and skill, with knowledge being passed from father to son from those very early times. And these are some of the Mason marks at Rosslyn Chapel, Dunkeld Cathedral, and Montrose Abbey. Waddell looks at it this way. Sumer started it, Akkad followed, Egyptian, Phoenician, Phrygian, Carians, Symbol, Lydia, Persia, Indo-Asaka, Hindu, Greek, Etruscan, this is Iberia, Brito, the Britons, the runes, Ogham. This is the progression that he follows in terms of time. He doesn't include the Hebrew because he said the Hebrew was so late it's not worth even mentioning. And the Hebrew text, as you know, is not much older than 1000 BC, and is based on the Phoenician letters, the alphabet, but they didn't use the vowels, which made it incredibly difficult to translate and understand, and also joined all the letters up. And so Aramaic and the Hebraic writing, it's very difficult to understand, and many of the great archaeologists in the 20s and 30s dismissed the Hebrew because they said, we have no Hebrew dynasty, we have no Semitic dynasty, we have no evidence of Semitic people. Who are these Semitic people? They're just like us in reality. There shouldn't be any racial distinctions here between Aryans and Semites, and this is something that we've brought into the picture and muddied the water very, very badly. Same again, this is from O to Z, and you can see the derivations here and the way that Waddell dealt with it. I'm not saying he's totally right, but he could understand 30 languages, and of all the people in the past, he was one man who I believe has unraveled the story better than anybody else. Certainly the story from early Egypt, pre-dynastic Egypt, right through to the British Isles, and the fact that the British, or the Barretts, and the Kassits and the Katai and the Hittites in this area here, this is where most of the people came from into Britain, and we find them going across the other side of the world too, and in their ships out to the Americas from very early times. A little more there to show that Hittites, much more important than people realize, and the Katis here, and Gary talked about the Katis, and we're talking about this is the sea of the Cats or Phoenician Goths. So the Cats were another name for the Phoenician Goths. So this is where we get so confused with so many names. Scotland again, prehistoric Britain, monument to Bel. This is a monument to Bel or Baal in the Don Valley in the Newton Stone, but Barry Dunford will talk about that in the next lecture, and a lot more besides. Some English words derive from the Sumerian. There are 94 words which are exactly the same in British today as were in Sumerian. And Waddell went as far as saying in Old English, half the words were Sumerian because of our various links. This was an interesting story for me when I started on this path, because I rang the British Museum and used to talk to them a lot. And this was a lady called Frances Wood, who's very famous now and ran the Chinese exhibition and top academic. But she was kind enough to be helpful, and she actually sent me this as a young man inquiring as to what was going on in China. And of course, it was a fantastic clue. Sumerian, the primitive script of Babylonia, from which in the course of time were developed all varieties of cuneiform. It was originally pictorial and had already taken on a conventional forms in the time of the earliest extant specimens of the language, that is between 3,000 and 4,000, now pushed back to 5,000, 6,000. Some scholars have found so much similarity between Sumerian and Chinese writing that they have conjectured the two races to be kindred tribes who once lived together in the highlands of Central Asia. The latest exponent of this theory is Dr. Wall, lecturer of Assyriology at Oxford, who has published an essay towards comparative lexicon of the two languages. And this is Charles Ball, Professor Charles Ball. Brilliant work. Literally every part of Chinese is compared to the Sumerian, and there again you can find direct parallels and direct comparisons. Same again with all those picture signs and what I call pictorial text in China with the pictorial text in Sumer. And the story is that we find people going from Karsag to China as early as 8,500, and then we have a migration of the Sumerian peoples to China at 2,700 when we get this exodus from Sumer because of all the various pressures and problems. So Hung Ti is Nung Ti, and Shen Nung is Sargon. And Sargon and all those kings traveled around the world to their various colonies. That's another staggering fact. This is a tradition of Sumeria, and this is the tradition of an ancient matriarchal society. It still exists today in China. And here we see a remnant of the ancient tradition of women choosing who and when they sleep with a man amongst the Muso people in southern China. The message is conveyed by a discreet tickle in the palm of the hand. Dancing for tourists below here, they do this for traditional headdresses and costumes. In the same mountains, we find surviving remnants of another amazing Sumerian tradition of a woman's exclusive writing and language, Emisal. The women in Sumeria had their own writing and language, and this is where we have a repository of incredible knowledge and history about our past. If some of you girls can get out there and find out whether you can extract that knowledge from the Chinese. A quote from the Mahabharata, which is the great Vedic history book. The able Paunch, or Phoenicians, setting out to invade the earth, brought the whole world under their sway. Another little bit of historical relevance that the Phoenicians had traveled the whole world. And remember, we're not talking about Celts in New Zealand as an archaeological project, which has shown that the Celts were in New Zealand before the Maoris were. Sumerians in Peru, this is again fabulous research and history by Verrill and Verrill. And Naram Singh, who's the son of Menes, was succeeded by Shah Ghani, who was under-king commander and companion to his father, as well as to his grandfather, King Menes, a position that may be compared to the Rear Admiral Viceroyal Governor. One of his signatures was Ginti, the T being the stone symbol. If these ancient Sumerian explorers actually visited Peru and erected statues and buildings, why, it may be asked, did they not leave records or inscriptions in Peru? As a matter of fact, they did. At Chasasua, about 150 miles north of Cusco, in a field near Uramba, a stone tablet bearing these 22 incised characters was discovered. So here we have Indus Valley, a genetic form of writing based on the Sumerian linear scripts. saying that talking about the lower sunset land at the divine temple of the sun god of fire enthroned, under commander of deep waters, under commander of Tu Jinti, god of fire, and the land below. So we have a very clear, and I've produced a lot more evidence in the previous talks about old world, new world links. And it really shouldn't be something we discuss anymore as being a problem, because it so clearly links to the old world. Now, the builders of the old pyramids is another really important subject in our history. Now, the Sumerian administrators of the Indo-European Empire, the top people, moved to pre-dynastic Egypt, a key people, about 2,780. But Egypt had always been a colony or a subsidiary territory of the Aryan Phoenicians from the time of An, Enil, Ninkar, and Enki, 9,300 BC. The ancient town of Abydos preserves evidence of an exceptional early civilization before 4000 BC. So these Sumerians were simply going to a part of the world which was much better than their Sumerian world was because of all the various problems. And Abydos is here. This is what Gary was talking about. And Hapgood's work on maps of the ancient Sea Kings shows this location here to be the datum point from which the whole world was mapped and surveyed in ancient times. Latitude, longitude, precise maps, incredible accuracy. And Professor Hapgood resolved this problem, and so did Professor Livio Staccini. But they were all talking about an ancient civilization far more sophisticated than ours, capable of doing these things and very accurate maps. And of course, nobody in the establishment liked the idea of that. Just a bit of fun. This is the helicopter here and the submarine or tank and the aircraft on the walls of one of the Abydos tombs. The only evidence I can find that they're not genuine is, it's corrosion, and they were messed around with after the event. But we do have quite interesting figures here that have caused a lot of excitement, and I'm not saying it's genuine at all. But you see here that larger version below. You can see very difficult to see. They're so similar, all three together of the same. If you just one, then you'd say, oh well, that's just coincidence. Two, well, that's getting interesting. But three, also similar. It's just an interesting observation of the past. This is the temple of Seti I in Abydos, which is the Ozarian, which Gary was talking about, which is the most important structure. Not a very clear picture. It's the best I could find, I'm afraid. But look at this. What Gary was showing us earlier was this extraordinary structure. And look at the engineering here and the roof. People are building not a tomb, they're building something much more important than a tomb. Nobody would have put the resources into something like this just to bury a dead body. And this is my theme now, which I hope you'll follow. Now, look at this. This is another one of those tombs, and this is the tomb to Ka at Abydos. Look at the storage rooms. And Waddell, and this is a drawing by Sophinder Petrie, and Waddell makes the point. Note the contents of the various chambers with provisions for the spirit of the dead king and his retinue. My thesis and my proposition today, and I went public on it on Red Ice Creations on last Monday, was that these were not tombs. Nobody in their right minds would spend that kind of time and effort and money and resources building tombs in this way. These are what I would call, in the war, we used to call them Anderson shelters when we were being bombed by the Germans. These guys were being bombed by cometary debris in a big way over a long period, and that's what I'm going to come on to. And what they did is build immensely strong structures which they could go into and survive from all that nature was throwing at them. And I believe that many of those Etruscan buildings and lots of the pyramids in Greece all had big cavities inside, and they were for people to take cover, as were our long barrows in this country, our dolmens. People constructed something as near as they could to a cave. But the greatest sophistication was here with the greatest and most sophisticated people. And you can see the engineering skills here. It's built very much like the temples in Malta, immensely strong. The temples in Malta would have been covered with earth. They would have been perfect shelters from the sky falling, which is what the Celts always worried about more than anything else. And this is the scale of Abydos as an ancient city, and behind the present-day city you have all these structures which are just massive and literally buried in the sand, and were originally, I believe, they were intended to be buried. And I agree with Gary, the Nile has silted up and water levels have risen dramatically since that time over the past 6,000 years. So they would have been dry and they would have been well drained originally, as our long barrows are today and all these other structures designed for that purpose. Engineering works, the same kind of big stones. There again, Gary has shown that in his marvellous lecture, the stonework, and we can track it back to these people, massive stones at that early time. And of course, we don't have to go very much further away from the Near East to see the stones at Baalbek and the massive obelisk in the quarry in Aswan, which is 1,250 tons, but obviously broke, so they didn't get it out of the quarry. Now, this is Zahi Hawass. He's the top man in Egypt today. The old kingdom from the 4th dynasty to the end of the 6th dynasty represents the height of ancient Egyptian culture and gave birth to the distinctive style and canons of Egyptian art and architecture. It was as if a master plan or program was devised during the 4th dynasty, which defines the specific forms, proportions, and order of art and architecture. Well, I've touched on how everything was set up, but of course, the point am I making about Egypt, as all the other Egypt, many of the what I call alternative Egyptiologists say, it was all there from the start. It was perfect from the start, and all that could happen was it was going to deteriorate, which it did. And this is another example of the art. This is the Median geese, and they are beautifully painted, exactly as they are today, those species. Beautiful paintings. And I've got a whole 2 volumes which were produced by Professor Alan Gardner, and Breasted in Chicago, and I've got all those images, and the art, they stopped putting art in the book after about 1600 BC because it had deteriorated so much. So they produced all the best material from those early years, and the purpose of the book was to actually record all the cave paintings and all these wonderful drawings before they deteriorated on the graves being and the tunnels being opened up to the air and all that was going on with the lights and everything else. So it preserved a record, a fabulous record, which is there now. Only about 4 or 5 copies were printed of the Egyptian art. This is Menes. King Menes as Menes Tusa, another name for him, found at Susa in Elam, another very important part, but not far from Dur Untash, a ziggurat at Dur Untash, which Christian O'Brien discovered with a French geologist when he first started work in the Mesopotamian plains for the Anglo-American Oil Company. That is a marvelous drawing by Ruth Ferrell, a likeness, and she took that as it was from one of the statues. And her book is Gods Who Were Men. It hasn't been published yet, but I had that cardboard box arrive in my home thanks to Bernard Delaire, and that unpublished book with illustrations, index, everything, incredible detail, was handed to him before she died, and I'm hoping to get that published. So anybody wants to know anything about that work, please contact me, because it's absolutely staggering. And it's Ruth Verrill, and she was a survivor of the Verrill pair, Hyatt Verrill being the husband, and who produced a book called Ancient American Civilizations, which everybody should read. And you'll see how many modern-day authors have plagiarized that material to produce their own sensational versions of the story. There's that hat again, combined 2 kingdoms when Menes was given the kingship of Egypt, because they decided they'd break the empire up and have it administered by kings individually. And these were effectively the king of kings, because the system worked from the city-states, but then you had this need for supervision from the leaders, and they always appointed a king of kings in difficult times. This is the Nile Valley. You can see how fertile and rich it was. This is Middle Egypt. Abydos is here. You also have Fayum, and lots going on out here now being dug because this was lush. And if you want to go back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 BC, you have to look at where people were when the climate was very much different than it is now, or it was even at the time of the building of the pyramids. Now, I just make this point. Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Waddell demonstrated a lifetime of incredible standards of research and scholarship, acquiring detailed knowledge of over 30 languages. He was highly regarded by the leading linguists and archaeological scholars of his time. His major language breakthrough came from his knowledge of the evolution of early pictorial text, realizing that early Sumerian and Vedic texts were virtually identical. This allowed Indian confirmation in providing a complete and accurate record of the Sumerian and early king lists. I've got them here. I'm not going to dwell on them because those sheets of paper, if anybody wants to look at them, are all together on the table at the back of the room. This is incredible work. He's got the dates, accurate dates for them. He's got the number of years they reigned and all the different names they were known by, both in the Indus Valley and in Sumer. So there's our, if you like, our history. We can see where we came from. We can see we have to go back to the Sumerians to see who our ancestors are and before them. And I hope you will read the books and look at the material I'm providing to show the link back to the original Karsag or Garden of Eden site, which is Christian O'Brien's marvellous work. But what happened? Why have we lost all this knowledge? What's going on? And that's because we have episodic cosmic catastrophe. But let's just see what's been happening. An asteroid hit the Austrian Alps and delivered debris all over northern Europe, 3,123. At the same time, we're getting craters in Australia, the Hembury craters. Not very big, but evidence that at that time there was a bombardment worldwide of debris. Here, we get a complete wipeout of the Bronze Age civilizations, or nearly, and the rest of them go 250 years later. That is the big one, and I want to concentrate on that big one because the thesis, my thesis, and other people's thesis too now is that we had a major cosmic catastrophe round about 10,800 and 10,700, which is the whole story of the flood, and the Earth being totally left in complete turmoil because it was tipped on its axis and absolute mayhem. It's described in the Sumerian records with Tiamat and Kingu, and very important that people see how bad things were. Now, the geologists and scientists are now uncovering all the evidence to how big a threat we have on this planet from space, from cometary debris. And we have to really follow that. All these dates on here, right up to the Tunguska, most of you will know about the Tunguska event on June the 30th, 1908, which would have killed everybody in Belgium if it had happened there. But there were 3 other ones since, which were similar sizes, but they didn't land up anywhere where there were people. With so many people on the planet now, when we get back into this phase of more debris coming in, we will have massive problems, and it should be our number one priority. And the key priority there is, for God's sake, have enough freshwater supply at home for at least 3 or 4 weeks, because as we saw with the floods in the West Country of England last year, we had people fighting in the streets over water just because the floods flooded the works where the water was being purified and came from. We are so vulnerable, you wouldn't believe it. On the 29th of July, 3,123, an estimated 1.25 kilometer, which is big, asteroid, observed by the Sumerian astronomers and recorded on a clay-inscribed planisphere, we're back to writing and inscriptions, explodes over the Austrian Alps with the power of 1,000 Tungunskas. Massive plume with re-entry of molten debris falling over a very large area of the northern hemisphere. A giant landslide centered on Korfos in Austria is 500 meters thick and 5 kilometers in diameter, and has long been a mystery since geologists first looked at it in the 19th century. The conclusion drawn by the research in the middle of the 20th century was it must be due to a very large meteor impact because of the evidence of crushing pressures and explosions. And this is research by Alan Bond and Mark Hempshaw. And it centers on the Sumerian knowledge and accurate use of a cuneiform tablet known as a planisphere. That is a planisphere. This is the kind of tool held by a Sumerian astronomer. And we now know that the Sumerians, and way back in time, we have the stories of the angels observing the sun, the stars, and the moon, etc. So astronomy has always been number one subject in the past because of what's being thrown at us in the past. Very, very important. Now, this is the British Museum collection. It's known as the Sumerian Planisphere. And astronomers, using this method of observation and measurement, could accurately date asteroid impacts. And the day that that asteroid hit Austria was known by the Sumerians and uncovered from the Sumerian records. It should tell you a lot. Ancient Sumerians were superb observers of the night sky and were credited with the founding of astrology, which surprisingly is still practiced and followed to this day. They passed this practice to their Assyrian and Babylonian descendants, who spread it to the Hebrews. And it's interesting to note that ancient Middle East cultures show a certain continuity, because the article says that the cuneiform tablet is Assyrian, and that it was a copy from a Sumerian original that was 2,400 years older. Well, that's taking us back to probably 4,000 BC. So astronomical observation was well-developed discipline and no doubt had well-trained observers. Modern researchers obviously taking this into account as they verify the meteorite theory. The ancient Sumerians are also credited with another astronomical observation. Now this is important because this has been verified recently too. An event that might occur every 5,000 years like clockwork. This is the date of the start of the Mayan calendar, and it doesn't take much to see that if it's pharaonic Egypt, biblical, Hindu, Maya are all talking about the same thing, that knowledge that the Mayas received came from the Sumerians and the guys in the nice hats which we saw earlier. They may well have come from the China direction of the Pacific, but they could have also come from the Atlantic as well, or both. This is another independent researcher looking at these catastrophes, the one at 3,200 or thereabouts, and the big one at 2,200 thereabouts. And this is the sequence of events that I proposed, that in 3,200 BC, multi-regional catastrophes and collapse of Europe, which I referred to earlier, of Mesopotamia and Indian cities. And 2,200, multi-regional catastrophes and collapse of Egyptian Old Kingdom, Harappan culture, Canaanite settlements, Malta and Akkad, in between the rebuilding. That's the Hembury crater in Australia. And this is a key man, the top astrophysicist at Oxford University, Victor Klube, who there again was shunned by the establishment because he was telling people things they didn't want to know. He's now retired in France, and he actually has given some jolly good lectures to people like us at the Andrew Collins conference. I first heard him. But the point is that he was a man, because he was so frustrated by the establishment, he was prepared to try and get his message out any way he could, which probably didn't help him in the way these people think in officialdom. And I hope we will get soon the Russian system of science where people have their free will to research as they wish and can actually provide the truth for the people, which is what they're there for in the first place. So what Victor Klube has done here is to show this torrid stream. And it's the torrid stream when the Earth's orbit is intersected, these arrow points here, and parts of the orbit, respectively above and below the ecliptic, are shown as thick and thin lines, And the Earth intersection epochs that evidently occur 2,200 to 2,000 BC, and it's taken 300 to 500 AD, implying a bombardment dust cycle of around 2.5 million years. Sorry, 2.5 thousand years. If you double that, you've got your 5,000-year cycle. And if you look at this, you've got your 5,000-year cycle in here. That was the last time we had trouble, 1200. Time before that was really serious in Britain. That was BC. That was again really serious. And we got the really big serious one here at that particular point in time, which I'm going to come on to. So this is one of our top men, and you've got all these confirmations from modern specialists with the ancient record. Now, the Old Kingdom pyramids and their purpose. I don't need to dwell much on this, but just look where the Old Kingdom pyramids are. They're all gathered together there. There's something like 85 of them, and they were all built within a 100-year period, and there isn't any evidence of any hard evidence whatsoever that they were originally used for burying anybody. Fact of life. We've just got this mumbo-jumbo idea that they were burying people because archaeologists couldn't possibly make any other suggestion. That's a step pyramid at Saqqara. Look at this. This is Saqqara and the step pyramid as it would have been. It's been reconstructed here. And we saw Gary Bilcliffe showing the walls of Saqqara, which are identical in construction to the walls of Kish. Probably the same family that built the walls of Kish built the walls of Saqqara, masonry, passing knowledge down from father to son. Great courtyard in the middle, structures outside, but a massive area. And that was a sacred area, a Taimon. This was an administrative building and center. It had all sorts of other things attached to it, as all the old administrative buildings did. And just look at this now. That's so obviously Sumerian, and it was the first one built of the Old Kingdom pyramids. Exactly the same design, step pyramid, whereabouts, Shakima Valley, Peru. Same time as the Saqqara pyramid. That's some of the best proof we've got that that Sumerian technology was going on in Peru as it was in Egypt. Here we have another lovely drawing by Hergé of King Djoser with his architect Imhotep at Saqqara. Can you imagine what it all looked like originally with polished limestone, or all finished off beautifully? Now, they added onto it to make it much bigger. Why should they do that? Why would they go all that trouble to make it stronger? And what do they have underneath? All these tunnels and things. And look at the vertical shaft. Do you remember Gary's vertical shaft and structure? We've got it again. Not many people know this about Saqqara. Why aren't we told? Look at that. 5.7 kilometers of shafts, tunnels, and chambers and galleries at Saqqara. It's a massive undertaking. Burying dead people. And look here, we've got the Doric columns, and we have arches. We have all the things that were discovered in Sumeria, all the technical, archaeological features of arches, and even the Doric columns. We're finding them here at Saqqara, because this was where all the very bright, clever people had come to with their designs and their work. Some of the chambers underneath the pyramid, as Gary showed a lovely image too at Abydos, were the drawings, ceiling drawings. But these were decorated with blue faisant tile panels. It represents a woven reed mat rendered in more durable material. This was carved solid rock, and they then went and decorated the carved solid rock with these glazed tiles. And we still don't really understand how they could have developed glaze for these tiles, because it is such a high-tech item. And we find these, of course, all over the early cities in Sumeria. There are the three Giza pyramids and all the associated structures. And here they are as they would have looked, something like that, with a white reflective limestone. Menkaure, Khafre, Khufu, the Queen's Chamber pyramids. Again, they call these Queen's Chamber. Big causeways going up to them. Massive buildings all round. All sorts of features around these structures, which were amazing. Here is the casing stones of the Great Pyramid, which has always amazed people because the joints are so good. But we now have knowledge that many of the ancient structural features in the old world were concrete, very sophisticated concretes, geopolymers, vegetable acids, all kinds of techniques were used to build things and create sculptures. And we're now seeing that they knew a great deal more then than we know today, or we're just beginning to find out today. Limestone casing joints of the Great Pyramid. Can't get a knife blade between them. Now look at this. Not many people know this. These are huge basalt stones on top of a limestone pavement. Absolutely amazing, on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid. Why would somebody go to all this trouble, engineering on this scale, to bury one dead pharaoh? All the pyramids, or most of them, have been found to have boat pits. What do they want boats for? And what do they want? A 142-foot long boat? And look at the design of that boat. Look at the keel and the design and shape of that boat. It's beautiful. The technology used for binding these planks was being used by everybody around the world at that time, including crossing the Pacific, America, the North Sea, you name it. This is the Grand Gallery. It's just an interesting, it was drawn in 1799, doesn't come up very well. But the ceiling in that passageway is 9 meters high. And there are all sorts of reasons for this now, and jolly good reasons, I think, to help pull the blocks up and build the blocks. They had a big weighted carriage in the King's Chamber which ran down and pulled blocks up on the other side, like a pulley system. And it gives a very good explanation of how they got up to that level without too much human effort. And also, what about the door? The door's halfway up. Why do you have a door of a pyramid halfway up? A massive stone on a hinge. And the suggestion is that it was so finely balanced that you could push it up with one hand. But certainly it could be swung up. And that's an interior door to stop the dust coming in. But that's the pyramid. And of course, they dug a tunnel in and broke into all this when one of the Arab caliphs thought that he was onto something good by breaking into the Great Pyramid. I think Dan touched on that. Mastabar. All around the structure are these mastebars, which are, again, in my opinion, Anderson shelters, bomb shelters. They may well have been used for burying people later on. These people always had dual uses. And remember, most of the people in the world at the time these were built exhumed themselves. I want to be exhumed on a platform, the end of a field somewhere, so the birds of air can devour my flesh and I can recycle my body usefully to wildlife. And so exhumation was what was done by the Red Indians and nearly everybody else at that time. And it's the only thing that actually makes sense these days, in my opinion. Many of those mastebars have double shafts, so I would think the double shafts could have been put in afterwards, but these were very, very strong structures and would have allowed those people who couldn't get into the passageways and the tunnels and everything else, all the valley temples, to take cover in their own perhaps personal mastabar, which they paid for themselves. Now, the big discovery for me was this, a television program on Abu Hawash called The Lost Pyramid. It's been known about for 100 years, but nobody really understood how sophisticated it was, and it was built by the son of Khufu, Jedefre, overlooking Cairo. And the bottom half was cased in pink Aswan granite. Can you imagine what that looked like? And it was overall, in height, you could see it was above the Great Pyramid, but it was a smaller structure than the Great Pyramid. But we'll look at the inside in a minute. But it was plundered. Some people say as late as Roman times, and all you've got is the stump. But you've got enough clues here to see that it was an absolutely superb pyramid, and structurally it was as good, if not better, than Giza. And here is a massive passageway going down, and that's looking back up. And right through the middle here is a massive internal space, which could have been timbered and structured into housing thousands of people, I would think, or 1,000 people. And here we have this shaft and this massive structure here, right in the middle, for people to hide from the wrath of God, as it was called. Cain built the Baalbek platform to hide from the wrath of God. And the Baalbek and Persepolis platforms in Arabic were built by Jinn bin Jan, Jinn, son of Jan, as lurking places for the genii to hide, because the genii was the other name for the shining ones. And here we have another boat pit, look. Great big mortuary temple, you name it, causeway. This is for getting a lot of people in a hurry at a crucial time, and storing enough food and water and all the other issues to cope. That's the view of it today. Why did they go to all that trouble? And the reason was because at 10,750 BC, human race was virtually wiped out because the earth was tipped on its axis. This is the book to read, Message from the Ancients by John Gagnon. And here you see the ice sheet. And the thesis is that the earth moved on its axis, so all that ice moved into a temperate zone. And this is all the meltwater discharges, and massive movements of the seas to Samis as a whole range of debris came in, and a large object passed close by the earth which provided sufficient torque on its own to tip the earth on its axis. And the books of Enoch our great historian, translated in 1927, actually used the word, the Earth's inclination was changed. So these are the conclusions, and I'm nearly finished, believe it or not, I'm nearly there. Egyptian Civilization of Sumer Origin by L.A. Waddell. Conclusions, 1930. That civilization did not first arise in Egypt, but arose amongst the Sumerians, known originally as the sons of Heracles, but later as Amorite, Phoenician, Goth, Scythe, Aryan, Akkad, Trojan, and Briton, who can be distinguished linguistically, but not genetically, from the Mediterranean or Iberian ancient peoples. Now, that is my comment in brackets, because I'm not taking the racist view which destroyed Waddell's reputation. He didn't mean it to be racist, but because he mentioned the word Aryan, he was seen by everybody to be supporting the German cause. And this was another problem we had in those interwar years, and a great tragedy. And we now know from genetics that the really interesting people are living both in Spain and North Africa, and that we all go back to one single male Y chromosome at 50,000 BC. We're a very close linked family, all of us, every human on this planet today. Aborigine, Sudanese, red hair and freckles. You're all so close genetically, it's unbelievable. That civilization was introduced into Egypt in fully fledged form by the Sumerians or early Aryans at about 600 years, 2,000 years from the latest research. And there's much earlier goings on in Sumer, and we go back to Sabi, Abiad, 6000 BC, Kutlai-Hayak, Jericho, etc. They didn't know about that then when he wrote this. After its origin by Sumerian emperors from Mesopotamia, the so-called dynastic kings of Egypt, about 2700 BC, or possibly a little earlier. And that king list is to you to look at outside. That Egypt, for some centuries subsequent to Menes, establishment of the United Kingdom of Egypt, about 2700 BC, was the chief center for the diffusion of civilization in the Mediterranean and beyond the Pillars of Hercules to the tin land of Britain. Menes was also King Minos, another very important point. This was the spread of their empire and their influence. That civilization in the closed, rich land of the Nile Valley acquired a distinctive stereotyped local complexion in many of its customs, beliefs, arts, crafts, and in the form of writing the Sumerian script, which was the source of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. That Egypt took little part in the diffusion of civilization in the East. The civilization in the East diffused from the Indus Valley and from Sumer itself, and Egypt played a small part in that. That in particular, Egypt appears to have taken no part in the diffusion of civilization to India, Indochina, and Oceania of the Children of the Sun. Now, W.J. Perry wrote a wonderful book called The Children of the Sun, and the big argument at this particular time in the 20s is whether Egypt was the starting point of civilization. And what Waddell did was come along and said, look, chaps, you know, it goes back to Sumer, not to Egypt. Sumerians came on much earlier. It can be debated because we have people from the land of Canaan starting very much earlier, and they had already been to Egypt and civilized Egypt from 9,500 BC. This is a little bit on our links, British links. We also discover that the Cymry, pronounced Cymru, or Cumbers of Wales, Cumberland, and the North Cumbri of Strathclyde appear to be derived their name from the alternative tribal epithet of the Phoenicians, namely Sumer. This latter was a term occasionally used by the early ruling race in Babylonia, the Sumerians of modern Assyriologists, and who I find were Phoenicians. They weren't Western Semitics, they were Phoenicians. This identity of the Cymry or Cumbers with the Sumers, suggested by my discovery in various ancient mining centers of Britain, and especially in the land of the Cymry or Cumbers of several scribings in the old Sumerian script of Babylonia, is confirmed by finding that Sumerian is the basis of the British or English language, of which we shall find many further instances, incidentally, as we proceed. It is also confirmed by the Welsh Cymry, a traditional account of the arrival of King Brut, or Brutus, or Pyran, as his name is dialectically spelt in Welsh in Britain. is found in the Welsh triads, which confirm from an altogether independent source the tradition preserved by the chronicles of Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth. So we've got so much to back this up and support this in so many ways. I'll come back to the Goths because they were immensely important, because they were the high culture. The Celts, the Druids, the Goths are all much the same high culture. And we had that high culture in Britain to the time of the Romans. And Barry's going to tell you about Scotland, which in my belief was certainly the high culture for the whole of maybe the world at one point in time, when many more people had migrated to Britain from Sumer as early as 4000 BC. And that's where we find the farmers coming in. But this is a little bit about what's going on later on. So Sir Flinders Petrie, speaking of the wreckage of civilization in Europe by the wholesale massacre and destruction by invading hordes of barbaric Huns, the arch enemies of the Goths, and by the Saracens, and the intervening internecine wars of nations resulting in the dark ages of Europe, he remarks, had the Goths been left alone in their humane occupation of Italy, there might have been a setback for 2 or 3 centuries, but by expelling them, civilization was thrown 15 centuries back. That's in a Huxley lecture. And somebody called Freeman, who I haven't been able to identify totally, maintained there was no setback under the Gothic imperial rule while it lasted. Italy under Theodoric the Goth was the most peaceful and flourishing country in the world, more peaceful and flourishing than it had been for a long time before under the Romans, or than it had ever been since, till quite lately. The dominions of Theodoric, and remember that name, Theodoric, stretched far beyond Italy to the north, east, west, and he ruled the West Gothic kingdom of Gaul and Spain as guardian for his grandson. Now the story is that Theodoric's son, Alaric, was the guy who sacked Rome, if you remember, when the Church of Rome got really uppity and was telling everybody what to do. And the Goths allowed and tolerated all religions, and the Goths were Arian Christians. They were Christians, Arian Christians. If you are a Catholic or an Anglican today, you have to look back at the history book and say, hang on a minute, am I really a Christian? And the answer is no. If you want to find out what Christianity is all about, you go back to the Goths, and you go back to the Gnostic Gospels, and you go back to the early records of Jesus and the Druids. A crucial point for all religions to realize that all religions evolve from the Druidic philosophy and practice, which we can trace back to Karsak. So Hindus, Buddhists, all religions of the world go back to Druidism. And the center for Druids, the Druids, and that high culture for a very long time was Britain, for various reasons, security reasons, but it also covered the whole of Europe and also North Africa as well. Very important point in our history. More proof. What John Gagnon has done is shown that the star shafts in the Great Pyramid are put in there deliberately to tell us just how big the risk is of being wiped out. And at that particular time, remember that all these pyramids, Old Kingdom pyramids, were built in the 100 years, within 100 years, about 150 years before 2000. 400. This is when the King's Chamber was built, 2,450, and our catastrophe was 2,345, 100 years later. What they were preparing for was another wipeout. They thought they could be wiped out completely again, as they had been at the end of the Ice Age. So the guys in the Old Kingdom had taken every possible measure they could to produce structures so that they could survive everything that nature was going to throw at them. Cosmic nature. That's why we have structures which could only have been designed for the power of 1,000 hydrogen bombs going bang outside, yet the people inside would have been okay with water and air and everything else. And the Etruscan picture that Gary showed this morning is so interesting, because that may well have been water. It may even been some system of having fresh air in that building if anything really nasty happened outside. So here we have it. When the King's Chamber was built, 2,450, the star shafts in the King's Chamber aligned to Alpha Draconis, North Star, and Zeta Orionis, the South Pole Star. 10,400 or 10,700, I think is the right date, from Paul Violette, with these two heat events. We've got a situation where Alpha Draconis and Zeta Orionis were in different positions because the Earth had tipped on its axis, inclined on its axis. And what the star shafts in the Queen's chamber, which are closed off, remember, actually record that situation to pass a message on to us. It's taken us a long while to find out why. And the rest of the John Gagnon's book shows much more evidence of all the other features of the Great Pyramid, which was built principally to leave a message for us and to store, presumably, a lot of incredibly valuable records, because it was the strongest structure of any of the pyramids built. Now, this is the Clube paper, his conclusion. Whether or not mankind recognizes the approximately centennial threat, that's every 100-year threat, is tantamount to choosing between apocalyptic and anti-apocalyptic outlooks on the environment. This question, as I've shown, is of deep historical and political significance, being intimately bound up with the origins of Christian doctrine and with the elitist desire to perpetuate anti-apocalypticism, along with its appropriately distorted cosmological setting. In view of the intellectual and cultural climate of irrationality which arises thereby, it's a moot point whether mankind will meet the challenge posed by this question before the next bout of apocalyptic terror descends. Such a situation represents an intolerable risk to civilization. That's what the top man says, and we actually have our Astronomer Royal saying that he thinks there's a 50-50 chance we're going to make it through the next 100 years. That's another little clue in the story. I've shown this because this shows you what was going on even in early Sumer. You have the symbol of the caduceus, of the angels, of the shining ones, of the genii, of the Karsag settlement, the serpent knowledge, which had nothing to do with snakes at all, but it was an emblem that was used for that knowledge, defended by two dragons. And the role of the dragons was to defend the serpent knowledge. And that was a symbol of the people in Sumer who understood the old serpent knowledge and hadn't allowed the denigration of the gods to affect them. And we have mentions here to St. Michael and a canonized second Sumerian king. Here is a lovely little piece to tell you what's going on at the time, at 2100. This is about Utu. I'm coming back to Utu, Ogmash, Shamesh. Now I swear by the sun god Utu on this very day, and my younger brother shall be witness of it in foreign lands where the sons of Sumer are not known, where people do not have the use of paved roads, where they have no access to the written word, that I, the firstborn son, am a fashioner of words, a composer of songs, a composer of words, and that they will recite my songs as heavenly writings, and that they will bow down before my words. And he's effectively was the god of music. He was the key archangel who was involved in this whole subject. Now, what happened to Utu was this. Now, that's what happens to you if you don't listen to Dan Winter and get your brainwaves out of sync. And this is the one in Mesopotamian archaeology. Percy Hancock found this, and it's drawn by Ruth Ferrell. And that's Shutu, the same person as Utu. They turned him into a demon. Exactly what Christianity's done is people don't turn them into demons and devils, and we have, God and the devil, this whole ridiculous story, which Lawrence Gardner's got a book coming out showing that the whole story of the devil is totally man-made to control people. But this is what they were doing then. And this is, of course, not just in Mesopotamia, but we got the same figure with the goat's ears in Mexico. And this, of course, is Assyrian, which means it's 1000 BC. It's very late. So they were denigrating the old gods. And in my previous lectures, I showed how the goddess Ninkarsag had been denigrated into the hag of the night. So I thought I'd finish on this because we come back to what we've been talking about. Perhaps the most important thing is understanding that if we balance the waves in our brain, we can also balance our personality and raise our consciousness. And there's a strange feeling here with Utu that if we drew a picture of a lovely man who got all his brainwaves mixed up and we'd factored in the problems with the brainwaves, it might look something like that, Dan. Anyway, the message is very clear, and we've been talking about it all weekend. We really need to reveal knowledge from the past and make very good use of it very quickly. Thank you very much.